Every year around Christmas, I rewatch my favorite anti-Christmas movie, Gremlins. And then, not to get too carried away with that sentiment, I wash it down with my favorite anti-Gremlins movie, Gremlins 2. If you haven't watched either in a long time, or maybe never watched them before in general, I highly recommend both. They still hold up, with the first being a very good creature horror movie, and the second going full cartoon slapstick to self-destruct the franchise, ruining any chance of making this a larger franchise with endless sequels. It's great fun. Gremlins 2 was one of the games that I was lucky enough to own instead of rent on the Nintendo. I don't normally do nostalgia-based coverage here on the channel, but I can make an exception for this one. Besides, it's the holidays. Everyone's always happy around the holidays, no matter what. Gremlins 2 on the NES follows Gizmo, struggling his way through the Clamp Tower during the Gremlins infestation from the second movie, presented through the form of a top-down action platformer. The platforming in this game isn't based around precision so much as it is based around timing. No tight jumps or hard-to-judge platform distances. The bigger challenges usually revolve around moving floors, traps, and the pressure of incoming enemies as you deal with the obstacles. Individual segments can be challenging at times. Fall down a pit and you're sent all the way back to the last tile of solid ground that you were standing on. And sometimes that journey goes back several screens. It might sound stressing, but for the most part, Gremlins 2 doesn't rush you so much as it gives you the feeling of being rushed. You need to get the timing right, but there's often ways to stall and make sure that you can move when you feel comfortable to do so. There's no time limit in this game either, so you can take as long as you need to get through any of the stages. Most of the real pressure comes from some smart enemy placements. It takes place in the first of its kind smart building after all. Flying enemies are often near uncomfortable jumps. Jumping enemies march towards you near the landing spots after a sequence of jumps. Enemies themselves aren't especially difficult to deal with, but they do add up to the traps and pits that are already there. Although, if you find yourself stuck in cramped corners where life slows to a crawl, there's always the balloon item that lets you skip all of that. If you fall down a pit, you get to fly past anything that was bothering you that you were struggling with if you have one of those balloons. There's a couple of things that are especially interesting with the combat in Gremlins 2 though. The first is that the game holds off on making you fight gremlins until you get the first weapon upgrade. The upgrade is lying on the floor at the end of the second stage in the middle of Billy Peltzer's cubicle. You can even spot the video phone and the drawing of the future clamp building project in the corner. It's really neat. After finding a weapon upgrade, you get the cutscene where Gizmo gets wet, causing the other Mogwai to spawn out of him, just like in the movie. After that, you go through the ventilation ducts, and from there, gremlins start becoming more and more common as enemies over time. It's really cool how they dare to hold off on the most known enemy from a game, when in the movie as well, it takes a while for the gremlins to show up. The other interesting thing is that Gizmo gets different basic attacks over time. You start throwing the genetically engineered tomatoes from the Splice of Life department. And during the same stages that you have that as a weapon, you even fight genetically modified giant tomatoes. Later on, you get a matchstick as your primary weapon, slowly working your way up to the all-powerful bow with flaming arrows that Gizmo fires near the end of the movie. It's an interesting way to have a sense of progression in a platformer, giving you upgraded gear while still making it fit with the source material. The extent to which this game goes to send up the original movie is absolutely above and beyond the norm. Video games back then often struggled to make sense of the original works when trying to fit a movie or a show into a game structure. Movies don't have to deal with stage structures, power-ups, or constant new enemies to fight. But just about everything in the Gremlins 2 game fits, with some extra flourishes to take it even further. Like that weird, shitty artwork on the walls during the first few stages? Yeah, that looks like a throwaway piece of pixel art, right? But that's the eye-pleasing, color-coordinated, authorized art made by recognized artists from the movie. Oh, and those TV screens with that little bit of movement later on? That's just Clamp Cable Network's End of Civilization broadcast prepared in case of emergencies. A satire of the rumored CNN End of the World video package, something that later turned out to have actually existed for worst-case scenarios when it leaked. Remember the Cooking Network bit? Well, here's the kitchen from that scene, as well as the graveyard set for the Horror Channel's show later into the same stage. Here's that secretary's desk with a moving paper shredder embedded into it. There's really neat attention to detail in the entire game. And it doesn't just come down to callbacks to the movie in the scenery either. The regular enemies reflect things from the movie too. Movie-based video games often struggled finding appropriate enemies, and even the best of them often stretched the definition of logical enemies to fill stages with. You might raise an eyebrow at the oversized tomatoes or the rats and the spiders of the early stages, but Splice of Life was experimenting with all of these things. The bosses are all familiar too, supersized gremlin sprites based on ones that we've seen in the movie. The only thing that's really missing is a brain gremlin enemy, which is kinda weird considering how big of a role that gremlin had in the movie. But otherwise, everything is represented. They even tied in the Chinese shop for the store that you get your power-ups from. Unfortunately, you can only buy one single item every time you visit him, which always seemed a bit strange. He's got 3 items on sale, but you can only get one of them. They're not exactly expensive either, and if you're any decent, you'll almost always have more than enough money to clear out the entire store in one go when you find one, at least if he'd let you. Maybe it would have been better if the game didn't have a money system and you could just pick a single item or something as a gift. But this is a very minor complaint. It's not like you absolutely need those items to get far into the game. The music is all original, so the famous Gremlins theme music doesn't play during the entire game. And you know what? That's perfectly fine. The soundtrack captures the high energy but still offbeat kind of creepy vibe that the Gremlins movies, the second especially, are known for. Sunsoft music is generally fantastic, but this is one of my favorite scores of theirs. I played both the English and Japanese release for this video. They're almost identical. The American release is pretty much in line with the European one that I grew up with, but the Japanese one has some slight differences that I found interesting. For one, the title screen looks a bit unfinished. Like the big gremlin on top of the logo is missing in the Japanese release. But the biggest change is how one of the levels has a lot more platforms to make getting past the pitfalls easier in the Japanese version. It especially stands out with that annoying part with the big fire-breathing gremlin at the start. I've always hated that part, but it's completely fine in the Japanese version. Besides those changes, you gain a bit of health at the start of every stage in the Japanese version. I'm not sure why the Western versions don't do that. It's not that punishing of a game to begin with. Continues are infinite, and they always let you restart at the start of the last stage that you made it to. Every time you go game over, you also get a password to continue from that point onwards in the future. So the absolute worst that could happen is that you get pushed back to the start of a stage upon dying. Extra lives let you respawn in the exact spot you died at and continue from there, even during boss fights. So even when the smaller individual challenges can get pretty hard and frustrating, the game overall isn't too bad in that respect. Now, before we end this, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in this review, because I think there are some fascinating ramifications here for the future. I realize that this was barely a review that I presented here today, but I still do recommend Gremlins 2 on the NES. It's one of the better licensed games of that era in my opinion. The only game that could have gone over it was Journey to Silius if it kept the Terminator license. The movies hold up too. I just wanted to share my appreciation for the Gremlins in my own way this year around the holidays. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk about why Gremlins is so great. Oh, before we go, one last poll for this year. What are we stocking up on? Canned goods or shotguns? The people voted for shotguns, and I think the Brain Gremlin would be proud of that. This was the last video for the year. I'm going to take my usual January off as every other year. Not to take a break, but there's 2 larger scale videos that I want to work on in that time. So I wish everyone a very happy holidays and the best of good luck in the next year. As always, this video was brought to you with the help of people supporting the channel on Patreon. If you'd like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen and vote in future polls, head over to patreon.com/AboveUp and I will see you next year.